An important week for three key issues in Washington. President Obama expresses his anger as gun control legislation fails in the Senate. Immigrant rights activists express their disappointment at a bipartisan immigration reform plan that promises millions of dollars to security contractors, but huge hurdles to citizenship. And a bill that allows the government to monitor internet usage without a warrant passes in the House of Representatives. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Monday's bombing at the Boston Marathon has understandably dominated the U.S. media agenda, but there have been significant political developments in Washington this week. Yesterday, the Senate voted to reject a bipartisan plan to expand background checks for gun buyers, drawing the anger of President Obama and relatives of victims of last December's Newtown mass shooting. On Tuesday, the so-called Gang of Eight, a bipartisan group of senators, published their immigration bill that they say will put millions of undocumented migrants on a 13-year pathway to U.S. citizenship and strengthen border security. And on Thursday, the House of Representatives voted to pass the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, or CISPA. The stated aim of the law is to help the U.S. government investigate cyber threats and protect the security of networks against attack. But civil liberties advocates argue it will give the federal government unprecedented powers to access the data of Americans. Before we examine each of these issues, here's President Obama's verdict on Congress's performance following the Senate's rejection of background checks for gun buyers.
I've heard folks say that having the families of victims lobby for this legislation was somehow misplaced. A prop, somebody called them. Emotional blackmail, some outlets said. Are they serious? Do we really think that thousands of families whose lives have been shattered by gun violence don't have a right to weigh in on this issue? Do we think their emotions, their loss, is not relevant to this debate? So all in all, this was a pretty shameful day for Washington.
I'm joined by Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief for the Huffington Post. And Adam Winkler is Professor of Law at UCLA and author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. Ryan Grimm, the voting did continue on various amendments even over the last few hours. And in fact, when you look over it, the most support over 2 days of voting were for the amendments that loosened gun control, in fact. Actually.
That's right, and this should give people a little bit of pause who push for doing away with the filibuster. It might still be a good idea to do away with it, but that means that some other things might be able to get through. Concealed carry, for instance, you got 57 votes for you to be able to carry a concealed weapon anywhere you want in the country, regardless of, say, whatever laws Manhattan or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or Chicago want to pass. So that would have destroyed the entire bill itself, because if that would have been included, all of the urban senators would have backed away.
But as things stand, though, nothing's going to happen. Gun legislation has been.
Harry Reid has pulled it off the floor. He can bring it back at any time he wants, but as of now, this issue's dead. All
right. Well, let's look at the proposal, the amendment that was defeated by just 6 votes, which is getting a great deal of attention because so many people are for it in the country. It would have extended background checks to online and gun show sales. It did not require checks for gun sales between family members or friends. And it also pledged to keep the government from creating any sort of federal registry of gun owners. Adam Winkler, what's the moral of all this? We saw the outrage from President Obama. These aren't terribly stringent measures, and they didn't get through.
Well, President Obama is just the latest in a long line of Democratic presidents that have run afoul of the NRA and been burned. Bill Clinton saw that his support of gun control led to a huge support for Republicans, and the Republicans taking back the House back in '94. Lyndon Johnson pushed for gun control back in the mid-'60s, and he had to water down his proposals because of disagreement among gun owners. So this is not unfamiliar territory. We knew that President Obama was taking a bold step by pushing for gun control laws that were going to be hard to adopt. It turns out that his strategy for overcoming that resistance wasn't good enough.
But there are those who say that perhaps President Obama, despite the sort of outrage we saw on display, didn't really stick his neck out. Neither did the Democrats, certainly in Congress.
Well, of course, most of the Democrats in Congress, in the Senate, did vote for the bill, with the exception of just a few, and most of the lack of support came from Republicans.
Because I meant the leadership. Yeah.
Well, indeed, but I think Obama really did make this a centerpiece of the last 4 months. He went out and did a lot of campaign stops. He talked about this issue. Remember, this is an issue that 6 months ago he didn't talk about at all, didn't do any events around. So I think he did push it, but I think they made some strategic mistakes, for instance, including the assault weapons ban. No one ever thought that was going to be passed, and yet we spent a lot of time trying to figure out why the government was going to go about banning the most popular rifle in America. It was a bad strategy designed only to get the fiercest opposition from opponents.
But do they really believe Ryan Grim? I mean, there are some, Paul Barrett actually of Bloomberg has written saying, even in the State of the Union address when he simply said the people, the families of Newtown deserve a vote, he wasn't saying the families of Newtown deserve this to be passed. And this was kind of, I mean, they didn't really believe this was going to happen, perhaps.
Well, you know, one thing to remember is that one of the no votes was Max Baucus. He's a Montana Democrat. The man running Obama's campaign on behalf of gun control is Jim Messina, who is his former deputy, cut his teeth with Max Baucus, is referred to around the Hill as the Baucus Whisperer. You know, the two are very tight. And Messina somehow could not persuade Baucus, who's up for re-election in 2014, to vote for this bill. And so it does beg the question of whether the up for re-election in 2014 meant more to Senate Democrats.
So, yeah, but why did they believe this was going to be different? I mean, did they really? You think?
I don't. You know, did they think they were going to be like Obama hadn't really tried this before, where he really went out, you know, hit, you know, he did as many speeches as he could. He pushed, he cajoled. And he still couldn't get that. I think his anger and his surprise was genuine.
Yeah. Professor Winkler, I mean, then this does go back to the whole approach. Again, not demonizing certain weapons, but certainly not the most popular rifle in America, for example. Not suggesting that those who like guns condone school murders. You know, to take a more public health approach, perhaps, bearing in mind the fact that most people are killed in America through accidental discharge of guns or suicide. But doesn't this suggest even that approach might not work? I mean, wouldn't the NRA and others, because the background checks is sort of a public health approach and a harm reduction approach, wouldn't they find a way to suggest that mandatory loaded chamber indicators were somehow against American values?
Well, there's no doubt the NRA has pretty much proven that it's going to oppose any law, even if it has 90% support among the American people. So they're going to oppose laws left and right. The question is whether you can build a political coalition to really favor gun control. One of the things that I think is hopeful for the gun control movement today is that even after this big defeat, it seems like there's going to be more energy towards creating a grassroots movement, and one that's active in campaigns. Mayors Against Illegal Guns is talking about grading senators and elected officials on their gun votes, and Michael Bloomberg and Gabrielle Giffords are promising to spend a lot more money on elections. If you can get some gun control voters out there, that will really change the gun debate radically.
But the NRA, despite the performance of its leadership in the wake of Newtown, despite its audited lack of influence in elections, is still so powerful. I mean, how do we explain this?
Well, you know, the NRA did have a bad November in 2012. They had the worst rate of return of any major spender in the election. Their candidates just didn't do well. But they were really able to motivate people to call their senators and to bring out the political opposition to this universal background check bill. They were very successful in it. And anyone who was thinking that the NRA was really a paper tiger, I think has learned a pretty good lesson today that they have to take the NRA very seriously.
Professor Winkler, thank you very much. Now, to the immigration bill introduced by the so-called Gang of Eight that's been heavily criticized by both sides of the political divide. Although it claims to create a path to citizenship, that path would take at least 13 years for an undocumented migrant to complete. It also comes at a cost, with applicants having to pay more than $2,000 in fines and fees. No one, however, who entered the country after December the 31st of 2011 would be able to apply. And what's more, the path to citizenship will be enacted only if various so-called border security triggers are met. They include proving that the US-Mexico border has been secured and that 90% of those crossing without required papers were being turned back. The bill proposes spending an initial $4.5 billion on increased security measures, including the use of drones. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined by Sarahi Uribe, National Campaign Coordinator for the National Day Labourer Organising Network, and Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post is still with us as well. Actually, interestingly though, Ryan, having just had that conversation about guns, I mean, I wonder whether there are lessons about immigration reform here, or is there a different mood in the Republican Party, so this does look like there might be some room for compromise?
It's a different mood, and the cash and the political dynamics are different. You know, with guns, you had the NRA 100% against absolutely anything, and we will annihilate anybody who steps out of this. Whereas immigration, Republicans want to get something done. The Chamber of Commerce is on board, and a lot of other conservative organizations would like it if their movement was not called racist anymore. So,
right, but
so they have some incentive to actually get something done.
Because then you wonder whether then, sorry, this has consequences on the sort of legislation actually being discussed and the kind of compromises being made. Is this the sensible, common sense sort of reform that you're looking for?
Well, part of the members of the Gang of Eight are in fact tied to big corporations that are all for-profit prisons, and it's not surprising that they would put so much money on the border when in fact the border is the most secure it's ever been before, and the border crossings are lower and lower each year. And in fact, they pour more money into border enforcement than they do, shockingly, into the FBI and the DEA.
And this is a bonanza, isn't it?
Right. $4.5 billion. I mean, that goes a long way for a relatively small industry. I mean, there are only so many executives that are going to, be reaping that. So that's a lot of money.
And so that's the first stage then. So first, these security measures have to be instituted. I'm not sure whether it's just a matter of the money changing hands or whether these targets actually have to have been.
They have to meet the targets within 5 years, and if they don't, well, guess what? They get more money to meet those targets.
But until then, what about the actual pathway? Does that even begin then, or does the clock begin on that?
Well, there's a new category that's been created, this provisional resident status.
Right.
It's not a green card. It's before you even can get this green card. And during that time, immigrants would be able to travel back and forth. And
so that's immediate, though?
That would be immediately that they could apply for that, and they would have to be in this status for 10 years. The problem is that in the meantime, they could still be deported for minor offenses because the bill does not at all address the record number of deportations that we're facing every day.
So, but then even then, after 10 years, the RPI, the Registered Prospective Immigrant, is only then beginning the application process for a green card there, right?
Exactly, and then it's an additional 3 years after that. I mean, clearly it's a very long process. When I talk to workers about this, they say it's torture to know that it's going to take me 13 years to be able to qualify. And there's other criteria that is not often talked about, like having continuous employment, or actually the phrase I think is regular employment. Well, it's very difficult to have regular employment in this economy, and there are also a lot of immigrant workers are in the informal cash-based sector,
right.
Nannies, day laborers, taxi drivers, restaurant workers. You don't have continuous employment.
And a regular presence as well, though, which kind of makes that idea of crossing the border in the meantime a bit moot, doesn't it? Or does
unfortunately, under our current immigration laws, being deported and then returning back into the country is a felony. So it remains to be seen whether those people will have an opportunity to be legalized.
But also then to apply for that green card after 10 years, you also need you have to meet those criteria. Also up-to-date tax payments, demonstrated knowledge of US civics and English, and then a payment of $1,000 fine on top of any other fines and fees that you've already. I mean, how achievable is this?
Well, that's the big question.
Especially for day laborers, for example.
That's the big question for us, and that's why we're continuing to push in the meantime for a moratorium. The president of the AFL-CIO, the biggest labor union in the country, has also come out and said, well, we need a moratorium while this gets sorted out because we're missing the very people that would be citizens. And no doubt that for the day laborers, we're often used as the bargaining chip. We're one of the most vulnerable workforce in the United States, and we want to make sure that we get included in this legislation.
And you say then it should take 3 years for a green card, but is that guaranteed given that there are also stipulations that that those applying under the scheme would be at the back of the queue? So, I mean, is it a minimum of 3 years, or is that a guaranteed?
Well, I believe there is some language to deal with the backlog that we currently have. You know, would take years, decades for people to lawfully immigrate, which is part of the reason why we have so much quote-unquote illegal immigration in the United States.
All right, well,
that's the secret. They're actually not going to the quote back of the line. Nobody wants to talk about that, which is fine. They shouldn't have to. But I think Republicans do think that it is somewhat achievable. And that's why it's 13 years. If it were 10 or 11, they'd be around for a presidential election. I don't think it's a coincidence that they took them just past the presidential election.
Well, very quickly then, Ryan, is this going to pass? Is even this going to pass then, with all of its hurdles, frankly, and its bonanza for private security contractors?
You know, who knows? But the fact that all the folks has been on the Senate and none on the House, don't forget about the House. You know, this is a Tea Party controlled House, which speaks for itself. So I think it has a very good chance of passing the Senate. But, we'll see what happens when it gets over the House. John Boehner has said he doesn't want to do comprehensive reform. He wants to do it piece by piece, and Democrats are not going to go for that.
Ryan Grimm, thank you very much. Sarah Uribe, thank you as well. And so on to the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, or CISPA. The bill would allow internet service providers and telecoms companies and the US government to share information. It would also grant businesses legal immunity for violating an individual's privacy so long as they acted in good faith, in quotes. Critics argue the language of the bill is vague, opening up the possibility that innocuous online activities could be presented as cybersecurity threats and shared with the government. Another concern is that it's widely expected that the National Security Agency would take the lead in analyzing threat data. And there's very little public oversight over the activities of the NSA. We'll get into that a bit later. Holmes Wilson joins us from Newton, Massachusetts. He's co-founder and co-director of Fight for the Future, a digital rights advocacy group. Ryan Grimm from the Huffington Post is still with us, thankfully. He can help us understand the Washington aspect of all this. And in fact, actually beginning with that Washington aspect, it was defeated last year, or stalled in the filibuster, which again is another interesting point to bring up when people are talking about filibusters reform in the context of gun reform. But filibusters have their use there, surely. That's
exactly right. If you like the status quo, then you love the filibuster. If you think the world as it is not as good as it could be, and you think that you could actually get there with a majority, then you don't want the filibuster. But yeah, in this case, the Senate was able to stop a bad bill.
All right. So why is it such a bad bill, Holmes?
So the intent of CISPA is to make it easier for companies to share information on security vulnerabilities with each other and with the government, which is great. The problem is they didn't include any requirement that companies strip out people's personal information before they shared it with the government. So we're talking your emails, your personal messages, your text messages, your photos, your real-time location if you have a cell phone. All of this could be shared with the government, and they can use it without a warrant. So it becomes a wiretap bill.
When there are attempts at putting in some sort of amendments to ensure there were safeguards in place?
Yeah, I mean, there was a straightforward attempt to make it so that companies would have to make some reasonable effort to strip out people's personal information before sharing it with the government, and that amendment was voted down and ran into opposition from the bill's sponsors. There were some other changes around the edges, but they were minor.
So, I mean, just to summarize then, the upshot seems to be that companies that we use on the internet could now be monitoring our activity for potential red flags, and those haven't necessarily been defined. And then if they feel that there are red flags, then they pass on all that information, whether it be emails and text messages, onto the government, who can then use it, or to other corporations for that matter, who can then use it however they want, and we don't necessarily even know that it's happening?
That's correct. And I think the real risk here is that companies are running into security problems all the time. If they start sharing information with each other and don't take care to exclude people's personal information from that, it's all going to be mixed together, right? And it would be very easy for them to separate it out. They've testified to that effect. But that's not how the bill is written. And so the real danger here is the government could approach essentially every major web business in America and say, give us real-time data on your users. And if they did that right now, the sites would be able to say, no, we can't. It would be illegal, and we would be sued by our users. But if CISPA passes, they won't be able to say that anymore. It'll be harder for them to say no.
Well, actually, on that issue of legal immunity, I mean, that these companies will then have immunity for passing on our data, even if it's improper. And we don't actually have any chance to use, for example, the Freedom of Information Act to find out what data is being passed on about us.
That's correct. And you know, even if a company said, we promise we will not share any of your information with the government under CISPA, we wouldn't be able to hold them to that promise if they broke it.
But practically, how would a corporation, I mean, do they have to set up whole departments then to start monitoring our internet usage? I mean, how would they go about this, and what criteria, again, I mean, is there any guidance as to the sort of criteria that they would be using to pass on information or to the government or to other companies again?
My understanding is that it's pretty wide open. I mean, I think it's possible that a company would do this carefully and do it right, but it's also possible that they would lump everything together, and you know, the information that showed something about a hack would be thrown together with information that you know, you and I would consider extremely private, and then the government would have access to both. The other issue here is that, you know, that there's no separation and there's no warrant requirements. The government can go and take that information and use it even to build cases against people.
What about this issue of where this information ends up then, at least as far as the government is concerned? Then we mentioned the National Security Agency. I'm certain we've done shows on the NSA before. I mean, do we really know what's going on in the NSA even now then? Actually, in fact, that's not a bad question to ask. I mean, how much security do we have right now? I mean, do we have safeguards in place that definitively prevent all this from going on right now, for that matter?
Well, I think anyone in the world who watches spy dramas has a sense that, yes, on some level, they are being surveyed online, and you know, there's some agencies out there that have access to this information sometimes, whether it's phone calls or packets. But I mean, what this bill would do is it would throw it wide open. Not just the NSA would have access to information. We're talking about Homeland Security, the FBI, even the IRS, even the local police could access this stuff.
From a political point of view, Ryan, this doesn't seem to have caused as much controversy as some of the previous attempts at this sort of bill, the CISPA. Then there was also SOPA and PIPA. And I mean, is there some kind of fatigue then, perhaps, about protesting these kinds of bills right now?
No, I think Holmes's groups and the groups that were aligned with his are just as energetic, if not more energetic, because they now have the movement built that they gained around SOPA. But the lesson that I think you can draw from this about Washington's political economy is that the small groups, you know, who are, let's call them do-gooders for lack of a better word, can win in Washington, but only when their interests, you know, align with other powerful interests. Like in SOPA, there were major internet companies that aligned with some of these groups. Now they might be able to build enough of a head of steam to head this off in the Senate. They have some powerful backers on both sides of the aisle. You got Rand Paul on one side, you got Al Franken on the other. But it certainly helps when you have powerful corporate interests whose interests align with your own.
And there is a bit of that going on there, isn't there, Holmes? I mean, we have sort of Mozilla and Firefox, you know, on one side, Google kind of ambivalent, and then Microsoft and others on another side. How does it all shape up in that sense? And is it all about money then, and who gets their voice heard?
Well, the problem is that there are many big American tech companies that really want to see this law pass, and that don't necessarily care whether they're required to strip out people's personal information or not. They just want to see the law pass. They want the liability protection, and they don't care about your privacy. And business sets the agenda, and it's really hard for us to counteract that. At the same time, we were able to stall CISPA in the Senate last year. And to some extent, you know, well, we have the White House veto threat, where the Obama administration has said that they have some of the same privacy concerns that we do. So there's a chance here, and we don't need, I think, the same level of public outcry that we had around SOPA in order to achieve a victory.
Very quickly, Holmes, I mean, we were just talking about immigration and how there's an enormous amount of money for security contractors in that. In CISPA, there'll be a great deal of money for security contractors too, won't there?
Yeah, and so there's a bit of a gold rush around cybersecurity right now, and you have defense contractors looking for legislation to pass that will open up new opportunities, new potential products for sifting through this data and making it useful to companies and the government. And you even have the co-sponsor of CISPA, Mike Rogers, standing to benefit personally, financially from products like this through his wife, who has business interests in a company that does this kind of work.
I see a theme running through our show on three disparate, apparently, topics. Thanks very much. Holmes Wilson, thank you for joining us and explaining all that. Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post, thanks for being with us throughout that. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share your ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.